The sun beat down hard on the dry dirt in front of Tomas's shop, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and made every breath feel weighed down. The air around the small garage just outside San Antonio was thick with the smell of burnt rubber, rusted tools, and oil that had soaked too deep into the ground to ever come out again. Cicadas buzzed loud in the nearby trees, their constant drone somehow both calming and irritating. Inside the shed, Tomas was bent over an old pickup axle, sweat streaming down his back, his hands black with grease. He didn't hear the girl approach at first. Her wheels barely made a sound over the uneven dirt. But when he looked up, she was there, stuck a few feet from the door. The front right wheel of her chair was turned awkwardly, jammed, and her tiny fists were clenched around the arms of the chair like she was trying to hold herself together. Her cheeks were stained with tears, but she wasn't crying loudly. Her face held that look of someone who'd cried enough to run out of tears. Tomas dropped his wrench without thinking, wiped his hands on his pants, and crouched down so he could meet her eyes. "You need a hand, little one?" he asked gently, his voice a little rough but not unfriendly. The girl, Lucia, tensed up for a second. Maybe she was trying to figure out if this was someone she could trust. Then she gave a small nod, barely more than a shrug, and the corner of her mouth twitched upward, the ghost of a smile trying to come through. That tiny smile hit Tomas harder than any heat ever had. Something in her eyes knocked loose a piece of him he thought had rusted shut a long time ago. He motioned for her to stay put, hurried to grab some parts, and started working. It wasn't easy. He had to cobble pieces together from old bikes and scrap metal, but he kept at it. By late afternoon, Lucia's chair rolled smooth, almost fun, almost like freedom. When he rolled it back to her, she didn't say much. Just reached out and gave him the biggest, warmest hug he had ever gotten. And though he didn't say it, Tomas felt it. Something had just changed. 3 days later, the folks living near the edge of that dusty quarter outside San Antonio pressed up against the rusted wire fences surrounding the old abandoned airfield. It was the kind of place where nothing happened unless a truck broke down or a storm rolled through. So when they heard the deep, unfamiliar roar of jet turbines overhead, people came out in their flip-flops and baseball caps, squinting into the hot sky, unsure what to expect. A sleek white and silver jet swept in low, slowed, and touched the crumbly tarmac like it belonged there, even if the runway hadn't seen a proper landing in over 20 years. The plane kicked up a cloud of dust so thick it swallowed the fence lines for a minute. When the hatch opened and the steps lowered, out walked a woman in crisp linen, like she had just stepped off a magazine cover and not a private aircraft. Her name was Sophia. She walked like someone who didn't have time to explain herself twice, and the way she scanned her surroundings made it clear. She didn't blend in, and she didn't plan to. But she wasn't there for appearances. Sophia was the head of a foundation called Bright Path, one of those tech-driven non-profits that had reputations for doing the impossible in places no one else bothered with. And more than that, she was Lucia's adoptive mother. Word had already spread that the girl from the wheelchair had connections, but no one expected the kind of connection that came with jets and linen suits. Inside the shop, Tomas had already gone back to work, pretending he hadn't noticed the plane or the woman. Sophia stepped straight into the garage, heels crunching on grit. "We need someone in Oregon," she said without preamble, "to lead the new mobility division. You'd have full autonomy, tools, tech, whatever you need." Tomas raised an eyebrow, didn't even look up from the work in his hands. "And you think I'm the guy?" he asked, more skeptical than curious. She didn't blink. "I think you're the only one who fixed my daughter without a manual. Or parts." He was ready to say no, had it on the tip of his tongue. But then he saw Lucia standing silent by the door. She didn't speak, just met his gaze, hopeful. That unspoken look hit harder than all the fancy offers in the world. On the plane heading to Portland, Tomas kept his eyes glued to the window, watching the shifting landscape as if the sky itself might offer answers he hadn't dared to ask out loud. That little shop in Texas, with its sun-baked floor and greasy counters, already felt far away. He sat a little stiff in his seat, his best plaid shirt still stained with old oil around the cuffs, and a small duffel bag tucked under the seat in front of him. It held everything he thought he might need, though he knew he'd probably packed all the wrong things. Next to him, Lucia clutched a little drawing pad and smiled like she was just going on a school trip. At some point during takeoff, her tiny hand had slipped into his, and she hadn't let go since. It wasn't forced or awkward. It was the quiet kind of trust that forms when someone fixes something important for you without asking why it broke. To her, they were already family, and Tomas, though not used to the word, found he didn't mind the feeling. As the plane descended over the cooler cloud-covered rooftops of Oregon, the tan earth and sun-faded houses of their hometown slowly gave way to rows of sharp roofs and grey-tinted buildings that looked more like machines than places people lived in. Tomas adjusted his grip on the bag and told himself he'd be fine. At the Brightpath headquarters, a place that looked more like a college campus than a tech company, people greeted him, but not quite warmly. Sophia introduced him with polite efficiency, but it wasn't hard to notice the stares. Some were curious, most confused. A group of engineers sat around a wide table, laptops open, voices rattling off metrics and stats, as if they were calling plays no one else understood. The worst of them all was Jason, a young engineer with a spotless lab coat and a smugness only someone fresh out of MIT could carry. He welcomed Tomas with the kind of grin that didn't reach the eyes. "You're the one from Texas, right? The mechanic?" His tone was almost impressed, but mostly impressed that someone like Tomas had made it that far. The meetings moved fast. Talk-of-talk ratios, AI integrations and projection forecasts bounced around the room. Tomas didn't say much. He just listened. And while he may not have had the lingo, his calloused hands stayed steady in his lap. Nobody else seemed to notice, but he already knew. Machines can speak, and not always with words. While Tomas navigated his new role among slick glass walls and humming computer terminals, trying to make sense of machines that were more code than nuts and bolts, Lucia began school in their new Oregon neighborhood. The school was different from anything she'd known back in Texas. Wide ramps instead of stairs, classrooms decorated with every flag you could think of, kids of all backgrounds and abilities walking, rolling, signing, speaking. No one looked surprised to see her in her chair, and that alone made her feel like she might finally just belong. Her first week went by in a blur of name tags, group projects, and a cafeteria that served tofu tacos on Tuesdays. It was on one of those Tuesdays that Lucia met Maya, a girl with bright eyes, big curls, and a flute case slung over her shoulder like it was part of her. Maya smiled easily, the kind of smile that made you forget to be nervous. She asked Lucia about her wheelchair, not in a weird or nosy way, just curious and kind, and then invited her to come watch her practice that afternoon. Lucia stayed. After school, sitting near the stage, while Maya stood in the center, fingers moving over the keys of her silver flute like it was second nature. When Maya took a breath and played a soft, fluttering tune, Lucia closed her eyes and saw stars. That same night, over leftover mac and cheese, she told Tomas she had a new friend who played like the moon. The next few days, the girls were inseparable. Between flute practice and Lucia's growing obsession with astronomy club, they came up with an idea for the spring showcase, a performance about outer space with music, narration, and drawings of galaxies pulled from Lucia's telescope sketches. Everything was going well until Maya found a note folded inside her locker. It was written in shaky, uneven block letters. Maybe someone who can't keep a beat shouldn't be on stage. No name, no face, just a note that sank deep. Lucia didn't say anything right away. She crumpled the paper quietly, tucked it in her pocket, and later that night, while Tomas polished old tools in the kitchen, she sat alone and fumed. Because nobody, she decided, was going to be left out of the stars. Days passed, and Tomas kept showing up to every meeting, even though his presence was mostly ignored. Most of the young engineers barely looked up when he walked in. They had their laptops out, eyes locked on lines of code or rotating 3D models on their screens. Jason, especially, loved to lead conversations full of technical terms, speeding through jargon like it was a contest. Tomas, on the other hand, just sat quietly at the edge of the conference table, notebook in front of him, hands still bearing stains no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. Then one morning, everything screeched to a halt. The team had been working on a new exoskeleton design for weeks, sleek, state-of-the-art, meant to help people regain mobility after spinal injuries. But now they were stuck. The joint system around the knee wouldn't sync with the torque produced by the electric motor. The sensors kept jittering, and the fit was off by a fraction of a millimeter, enough to make the whole thing unreliable. Everyone tried to troubleshoot using spreadsheets and diagrams, arguing over geometry and voltage. Nothing worked. During a break, Tomas walked to the cafe inside the building, sat at a corner table with a cup of black coffee, and pulled a napkin from the dispenser. While chewing on a pen cap, he started to sketch something, an old trick from his days fixing long-haul trucks in El Paso back in the 90s. On drawing rough metal teeth, a simple locking hinge, and a flexible plate that acted as a cushion, he muttered to himself, tapping a finger along the edge of the napkin. Jason found him later, noticed the drawing, and scoffed loud enough for 2 interns to glance over. But after a few more agonizing hours and failed simulations, he circled back, napkin in hand. "Fine," he said without eye contact, "let's test this." The shop crew adapted the prototype to include the changes. Within an hour, the new joint fit perfectly. The sensors registered stability, and the motion was smoother than anything they'd tested before. The whole room went quiet. All eyes turned toward Tomas. This time no one was whispering. The room had shifted. Tomas didn't make a big deal out of it. He just rubbed his palms on his shirt, shrugged, and said, "It's never just about what the part is. It's about what you believe it can do." Not long after the breakthrough with the exoskeleton joint, something unexpected happened. A video started making the rounds online. Nothing fancy, shot on a school tablet, slightly shaky. It showed Lucia giving a short talk in class, explaining the tweaks in her wheelchair. She used simple language, pointing to the removable armrests, the modular battery slot, even a set of custom gears Tomas had added to help her adjust the height without needing help. Her voice was steady, proud, and funny too. At the end, she said, "My chair doesn't move for me, it moves with me." That part got people. Within a week, schools from all over the country were emailing for more info. Parents from overseas started reaching out through the BrightPath site. A kid in Japan sent a drawing of his dream wheelchair. A girl in South Africa asked if Lucia would do a virtual chat with her class. A group in Minnesota asked if Tomas could mentor their robotics club. It was bigger than anyone had expected. That's when Diego showed up. Smooth talker, suit that looked too sharp for Portland, and a grin like he had already sold whatever he was pitching. He had backing from a tech firm in California, and numbers that made even Sophia raise an eyebrow. Mass production, marketing campaigns, global rollout. But there was more between the lines, closing small community shops to eliminate competition, locking the designs behind strict patents, and streamlining features to cut costs. He used words like scalability and disruption, but Tomas heard something else: limits, restrictions, walls. For a man who had spent most of his life working with second-hand parts and borrowed tools, the idea of controlling access to something meant to help others didn't sit right. He didn't give Diego a straight answer, and it hung over him like buzzing static. He stayed late at the workshop, drawing, wiping his hands, staring at the ceiling. Then, while sorting through emails one night, he saw a name that froze him. Marisol, his ex-wife. They hadn't spoken in years. The message was short. No greetings, no small talk, just a line that hit him like a wrench to the chest. Your son, Daniel, is living in Seattle now. He's coding games. You should talk. Tomas sat back, heart pounding harder than any engine he'd ever repaired. The message itself wasn't long. Just one line, really. Figured you'd want to know he's doing fine. That was all it took. Tomas stared at the screen, rereading the words like some part of it was hiding more than it said. The sender's name, Marisol, dragged up a weight he hadn't carried for years, and the name tucked inside the message, Daniel, landed like a blow to the chest. He hadn't spoken that name out loud in almost a decade. The years had passed, but the guilt never left. He'd told himself dozens of times that stepping away was the right thing, that Daniel needed space to grow. He built up this quiet version of the story in his mind, one where he was the noble father who'd made sacrifices for stability. But in reality, he had just walked out when things got too heavy, when the hospital visits dragged into months, when his own fear became louder than the love he had for his son. The truth was never clean. And the truth was, he left because it hurt and because he didn't know how to stay. There, in the hallway at Brightpath, Tomas stood motionless, still holding onto his phone like it was some fragile gear he couldn't afford to drop. Everything around him was moving, technicians rushing by, screens blinking with updates, someone laughing down the corridor. But he was stuck, frozen between past and present. That's when Lucia appeared beside him. She didn't say anything. Right away, just tugged on his sleeve to get his attention. Then she held out a piece of lined notebook paper, folded neatly in half. Her small, careful handwriting filled the center of the note. You fixed me without knowing me. Maybe it's time to try with someone you do. He read it once, then again, slower the second time. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. Her message was clear, sharper than anything said in those meeting rooms. With a sigh that felt like something old leaving his chest, Tomas nodded. He folded the note and tucked it in his jacket pocket. Later that night, he booked a one-way train ticket to Seattle, holding the phone longer than he needed before finally typing out a message to Daniel. Just one sentence. I'd like to see you if you're okay with that. The train ride to Seattle carved through hills and forests that looked like something straight out of an old picture book. Trees leaned close to the tracks, like they were listening. The sky above shifted between clouds and soft sunlight, casting a warm glow over the scattered lakes and sleepy towns along the way. Tomas sat by the window, trying not to fidget, but his fingers kept running over the rim of his cup. He had tackled engines on fire, cut deals in broken English across dusty garages, and rebuilt frames with nothing but scrap and a wrench. None of that ever made him feel like this. By the time the train pulled into the station, his stomach was tight. He took a bus, followed directions on his phone, and stood quietly outside the tall glass building where Daniel worked. He'd looked up the place the night before, even double-checked it that morning, but standing there was entirely different. Inside the lobby, he froze. Tomas told the front desk clerk he just wanted to leave a coffee and a note. Nothing big, just something to say he had come. The barista had written Daniel's name on the cup alongside a wobbly, smiley face, but as Tomas fumbled through his pocket for the folded paper, he heard footsteps. He looked up. The hallway felt too silent all of a sudden, and there he was. Daniel was taller than he remembered, all adult now, with headphones around his neck and tired eyes, same color as Marisol's. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, close enough to touch but still holding a kind of distance. Tomas's mouth was dry and the words didn't come easy. "Hey," Daniel said quietly. "Hey," Tomas replied. The conversation that followed wasn't full of big explanations or dramatic reconciliations, just a few short lines. "How are you? You look well. I wasn't sure if I should come." Pause after pause, but no anger. The quiet had weight to it, but not the sharp kind. It felt like something softened with time. When Tomas mentioned the exoskeleton project, and how the idea first started when he was holding Daniel as a newborn and thinking about movement, Daniel looked away for a second, then nodded. They agreed to meet up that weekend. Before they parted, Daniel hesitated. "Tomas, I think I want to see what you're building down there." Daniel arrived in Portland on a rainy Friday morning, the kind of drizzle that hangs in the air and makes everything smell like wet pavement and pine. Tomas picked him up in an old pickup that still rattled when making a right turn, but it ran fine, which was all that mattered. Neither man said much during the drive. The old awkwardness poked its head in now and then, but it didn't settle. Little by little, the silence felt more like ease than tension. When they walked into Bright Path's workshop, Daniel stopped in the doorway and just stared. The place buzzed. Kids soldering wires, engineers arguing about circuit design over burritos, and wheelchair parts stacked next to 3D printers. The air smelled like metal, rubber, and takeout. Somewhere in the back, Lucia was showing Maya a telescoping arm attachment she'd helped sketch. Daniel's face lit up. He wasn't the type to say much when he was amazed, but Tomas watched his son's expression shift from surprise to admiration. Then curiosity took over. Daniel dove into the design files, flipping through prototypes and code folders. Within hours, he spotted it, a vulnerability buried deep in the Foundation's main server. Nothing had happened yet, but it would have been easy for someone to grab design specs or user data. Daniel patched the hole without fanfare, left notes clearly marked for others to follow, and then tapped Tomas on the shoulder. "You might want to check your login privileges," he said with a little grin. Beneath that was trust, finally rekindling. Tomas didn't need to say thank you out loud. The look they exchanged was enough. Whatever caution had still been sitting between them seemed to melt, and from that point forward, Daniel was all in. He teamed up with Lucia, who was more than happy to give him a full tour and a long list of stuff we still need. She even introduced him as my maybe brother, which made Daniel laugh for the first time that weekend. Together, they started shaping a new idea, an app where people around the world could share solutions, tweaks, and adaptive tech ideas. No fancy gatekeeping, just open tools, real problems, and everyday fixes, a patchwork of global voices. But then, just as momentum built, Sophia didn't show up to Monday's check-in. Her desk sat perfectly tidy. No messages, no word at all. It was like she'd simply disappeared. The day after Sophia vanished, the whole place felt different. The usual chatter in the workshop had turned quiet. Her office, usually open with sticky notes on the door and a coffee mug balanced on a stack of folders, was locked. No one could reach her. Email responses had stopped. Her phone went straight to voicemail. By Wednesday, rumors were spreading, but it wasn't until 2 lawyers in dark suits showed up carrying thick binders that everyone realized something serious was going on. Tomas hadn't expected to be called into the conference room, but there he was, seated across from 2 quiet legal reps and a few members of the Foundation's board. Daniel had offered to come with him, but Tomas shook his head, better to handle it himself. One of the lawyers flipped open a folder and turned it toward him. "There's a buried clause in the partnership paperwork from the Foundation's early restructuring," she began, tapping a finger on the page. "You were listed as a founding managing director. It was registered months after the prototypes gained national grants. Tomas blinked. I never signed that. You did. At the time, it was in a document approving part of the production budgeting. You probably didn't read all the fine print. He didn't. Turns out Sophia had quietly added his name to the core leadership list, probably knowing someday something like this might happen. Now, with her gone, the board was divided. Some wanted to freeze all operations until they got things sorted. Others argued for dissolving a chunk of the non-profit's assets and selling off parts of the design to private firms. The exoskeleton, the smart wheelchairs, the open-source plans, it could all be shelved, sold, or repackaged under someone else's control. The lawyers waited. His vote mattered. According to the clause, he could walk away and the board could do what they wanted, or he could stay and fight to keep things running. He went to the window, looked out at the parking lot, then to the corner of the shop where Lucia was helping Daniel debug a tablet. Her laughter drifted faintly down the hallway. That memory, paired with the moment Daniel had briefly touched his shoulder 2 nights before, grounded him. Tomas turned back to the room, exhaled and said, "I'm not going anywhere." Once, the board tension faded and things began to settle. Tomas wasted no time getting back to what mattered. With Daniel now fully by his side, they pulled long hours in the workshop, not just repairing and improving models, but thinking way beyond the walls of Brightpath. There was this old plan Tomas had shelved years ago, something he once scribbled on the back of a cereal box during a night of restless thinking. The idea was simple. What if instead of building everything in one place, they helped people build where they already were? He reopened that idea with Daniel, and together they cleaned it up and got serious. It would start small, with decentralized hubs run by locals using materials and methods that made sense in their area. It wasn't about perfect machines. It was about machines that fit, tools that felt familiar in the hands of someone halfway across the world. Their first partner was a mechanic named Joaquim, who lived just outside Salvador, in the northeast of Brazil. Word had reached them through a comment on Daniel's app. Joaquim didn't have fancy equipment, but he made strong, lightweight prosthetic legs using bamboo frames and bike gears, and folks from miles around came to him for help. Tomas called him on a spotty video connection, and right away it was obvious. They spoke the same language, even if it wasn't always smooth Portuguese or English. It was the language of people who know what it's like to build something out of scraps for someone who thinks they've run out of options. At the same time, the app Daniel created started proving its worth in ways no one had expected. Users from villages, favelas, refugee camps and mountain towns began uploading short videos and photos, showing off adaptations they'd come up with. Waterproof joystick covers made from balloon scraps, seat cushions filled with rice husks, foldable wrench kits made out of old lunchboxes. These designs weren't polished, but they worked. A live map on the app began to light up, each pin a different corner of the planet. What started as one solution in Portland was growing into a movement. Tomas looked at the screen one night, Daniel beside him, and watched new submissions arrive in real time. They didn't need translations. The purpose was clear. The world had begun to speak in bolts and wires, in compassion, and in the shared rhythm of fixing things that matter. A few weeks after the outreach map went live, and the first international hub was running reliably, Sophia returned. It was sudden, just like her disappearance. Tomas had been in the middle of fixing a stripped bolt on a hand-pedaled trike when he saw her through the window, standing near the front steps, pale but smiling. Her hair was shorter, and her frame thinner, but her eyes had that same spark she always carried into meetings. She explained everything later that afternoon, sitting in the break room with a teacup warming her hands. She had gone through an experimental treatment in San Diego, trying to slow the loss of her vision. I didn't want to make promises, she said softly, so I didn't tell anyone, but I knew you'd figure things out. Her words weren't proud, more like they came from trust, and to her credit, they had figured it out, mostly. But her absence had left marks, big ones, especially on Lucia. The moment Lucia saw her, she froze, then crossed the room in a rush and wrapped her arms around Sophia so tightly it caught everyone off guard. But even as she hugged her fiercely, something about Lucia felt different. Her usual spark was dimmer, she didn't let go right away, and when she did, her eyes didn't meet anyone's for too long. No one said much about it until the following Thursday, during a small school event at Madison High. Lucia had been working on a presentation about adaptive tech in classrooms, and Letitia had agreed to help her speak. They'd practiced for days, but when the microphone passed to Lucia, her whole posture changed. She looked down, went quiet, then left the stage without a word. Backstage, Letitia tried to talk to her, but Lucia just shook her head. A volunteer led them to a side room where she finally spoke. "I thought she wasn't coming back," she whispered, tears tracking down her cheeks. "Just like before. First my mom, then my dad. And now, her. I thought I messed it all up." Hearing. That broke something in Sophia. For so long she'd loved Lucia fiercely, but from a distance, as if closeness might not survive her busy world. But that night changed her. She began showing up differently, picking Lucia up herself, sitting in on math homework, even when she didn't understand the problems. From then on, the love wasn't just spoken, it was seen, every single day. The months that followed brought a wave of momentum, with workshops sparking up in places like Lake Tahoe, Recife, and even the outskirts of Nairobi. The project was becoming more than anyone had imagined. The app Daniel built had gone from a small tool into a powerful network. People were sending in blueprints, translation files, feedback on materials, even short repair tutorials filmed in barns, garages, and tech labs. Brightpath felt alive again, humming with steady purpose. But that kind of growth also brought new eyes, and not all of them with good intentions. Marcus, the investor who had helped fund the second manufacturing arm, had always seemed supportive, if a bit too polished. He rarely showed up in the workshop, preferring to sit in meetings or host quiet calls in his office. Sophia thought he was just keeping to his role. Tomas didn't trust him fully, but he kept the peace. Meanwhile, Daniel noticed little things. First, it was duplicate login attempts traced back to unexplained IP addresses. Then, specific internal documents about proprietary tech started floating around a private cloud folder with no record of team uploads. It didn't feel like a glitch. Daniel, who had been tweaking the system's security layer anyway, decided to quietly run a sweep using scripts he'd written himself. What he uncovered hit like a punch. Schematics, design videos, and usage reports had been getting siphoned off for weeks. The digital trail led straight to Marcus. Daniel didn't lose his cool. Instead, he prepared everything into one clear packet, labeled it carefully, and requested that it be added to the agenda of the next open board meeting. When the day arrived, Tomas, Sophia, Marcus, Lucia, and the rest of the core team gathered, as usual. At first, it all felt routine, but halfway through, Daniel stood up and calmly connected his laptop to the main screen. "I think everyone should see this," he said, clicking through the trail of data leaks with recorded timestamps, email logs, and the name that surfaced again and again, Marcus Silva. The room fell silent. Marcus's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no one gave him the chance. Tomas looked at him just for a moment, then said evenly, "A parts thief never knows how to build it right anyway." Silence broke into applause, near the peak of the project's success. As things were beginning to stabilize after Marcus's betrayal, the team received sudden, jarring news. Matteo, the Italian-born engineer who had once clashed with nearly everyone on the team, especially Tomas, had been in a serious motorcycle crash while riding along Highway 1 during a weekend trip. A deer had darted out of nowhere, and the impact sent him flying. He survived, but when he woke up in the hospital 2 days later, he learned the spinal damage was severe. The doctors told him he might never walk again. Matteo didn't take it well. He refused visitors and stopped replying to texts and emails. Even Lucia's voice message, the one she recorded at the workshop with everyone saying hi in the background, went unheard. His sharp independence, the thing so many had found frustrating about him, now became the wall that kept everyone out. Sitting alone in his hospital room in Santa Clara, he spiraled into silence and anger. But then, one morning, a nurse rolled in a large box. No note, just a label with his name, handwritten. Inside, wrapped in foam padding and cloth, was a custom-built mobility prototype. Sleek, compact, unlike anything he'd ever seen on the market. Matteo ran his fingers along the hand-forged aluminum joints and the padded seat frame. The design wasn't flashy. It was smart, efficient. It was built by someone who knew him, his habits, preferences, even his love of adjustable angles. He turned the chair over slightly and found a small mark under the base. Just initials, TA. No big announcement, no lecture, just this. Quiet gift of dignity from Tomas, the man he'd once accused of being too sentimental for engineering. Something shifted in Matteo that day. A week later, he rolled into the lab unannounced, still sore, but present. He didn't say much, just nodded when people greeted him. He met Tomas's eyes across the room, and they shared a silent beat. That was enough. The next few weeks, they worked on a new attachment together, a self-leveling caster that could handle uneven surfaces without jerking the frame. The conversations were technical, dry, awkward at first, but the trust slowly returned. For Tomas, it wasn't just about the new piece. Watching Matteo back at the bench, focused, grateful, changed, it felt healing. Tools could fix machines, sure, but sometimes design stitched up wounds in places even deeper.